Norah Vance couldn't remember when she had slammed the accelerator all the way to the floor. Gunfire tore through the night mist at Charlestown Harbor, each shot stealing another beat from her heart. The rear windshield shattered into 1,000 pieces, raining onto the leather seats like hail. Her hands, the same hands that hadn't trembled once in 3 years, were now white as bone, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that pain shot through her knuckles. Up ahead, through the haze of gun smoke, she saw him. Declan Cain, the most powerful crime boss in Boston, the man who could silence an entire underworld with a single glance, was crouched behind the mangled door of an armored Lincoln, with nowhere left to run. 36 hours earlier, Norah had placed her resignation letter on the mahogany desk in his office with her own hands. She had been ready to disappear from his life forever, and yet now, with life and death hanging in the balance, she was the only person driving an unarmored car straight into a storm of bullets to save him. "Get in the car!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the gunfire. There wasn't a second of hesitation. There wasn't a single calculation of what she stood to gain or lose. There was only instinct, the kind of instinct that even 5 years of training herself never to show fear couldn't extinguish. If anyone asked Norah why she had come back, she wouldn't have an answer she could put into words. The answer lay in the speedometer needle surging past 110 kilometers per hour, in the way she was willing to die for a man she had decided to leave forever only a little more than a day earlier. Before the story begins, don't forget to comment the city where you're watching this video and enjoy the story. 36 hours earlier. The music from 3 floors below rose through the old bones of the Beacon Hill mansion, a string quartet playing something elegant and hollow, the kind of song meant to make powerful people feel civilized, while they toasted a marriage that would reshape the map of Boston's underworld. Norah Vance stood alone in Declan Cain's private office on the top floor, and up here the music was only a distant vibration in the hardwood, a heartbeat she could feel through the soles of her plain leather flats. She had chosen those shoes on purpose. Flat, quiet, forgettable. Everything about the way she dressed had been engineered over 5 years to make her invisible, and tonight of all nights she needed to disappear cleanly, without leaving so much as a ripple on the surface of the water. The office smelled the way it always had, of old paper and aged whiskey and the faint metallic trace of the gun oil Declan used on the pistol he kept in the top drawer of the desk. She had come to love that smell, the way a person comes to love something they know is bad for them. For 5 years, this room had been her fortress and her prison all at once. She knew which floorboard near the window let out a soft groan when the weather turned cold. She knew the combination to the wall safe hidden behind the grim seascape painting that Declan despised but refused to remove because his late father had bought it at auction. She knew where every unregistered phone sat in the bottom drawer, knew the name of every judge on the family payroll, knew the exact figure the Cain organization had moved through its shell companies in the last fiscal quarter down to the final decimal. She knew everything about this man and the empire he ran. Everything, that was, except how it would feel to watch him slide a diamond onto another woman's finger and call it strategy. On the leather blotter in the center of the desk sat a single sheet of heavy cream paper. 2 sentences, printed in a clean serif font, no signature yet, because her hand had refused the pen the first 3 times she tried. She had drafted the letter 2 days earlier, the moment the rumor of an alliance with the Whitfield family hardened into cold fact. The merger required a marriage. Declan, ever the pragmatist, the 3rd generation of Cains to sit at the head of the table, had not hesitated for even a breath. He had traded a wedding for shipping lanes and political cover the way another man might trade a car. It was business. She had always known she was business too, a line item, an asset, the woman who kept the machine running and the blood off the ledgers. Norah looked down at her own hands resting on the edge of the desk. They were steady. She had trained the tremor out of them 3 years ago in the back of a speeding vehicle while she pressed a folded jacket against a wound in Declan's side and told him in a voice flat as ice that he was not going to die, not tonight, not on her watch. Panic was a luxury. Emotion was a liability. She had repeated those two sentences to herself so many times over the years that they had worn a groove in her mind, and yet standing here now, listening to the celebration of his engagement rise up through the floor, she felt something behind her ribs that no amount of discipline had ever managed to kill. 5 years. She had come to the Kane organization not as a foot soldier or a driver, but as a forensic accountant. A woman who could look at a column of numbers and see the lie hiding inside it faster than any federal auditor alive. Declan had found her when she was untangling the books of a small shell company on the wrong side of the harbor, work she had taken because it paid, and because after everything that had happened to her family, respectability had stopped meaning anything. He had watched her flag a skimming operation that 3 of his own men had missed, and the next morning he had offered her a position and a salary that made her laugh out loud before she understood he was serious. She had told herself it was only a job. She had told herself the same thing when she started managing the family's data security, when she began running the quiet intelligence channels that kept the Kanes one step ahead of their rivals and the people who wanted them in prison. She had told herself it was only a job, right up until the night in that speeding vehicle, when his blood was warm on her hands and his eyes found hers in the dark, and something passed between them that she had spent every day since pretending she had imagined. She had fallen in love with him somewhere in those 5 years, quietly, shamefully, the way rot spreads beneath a beautiful floor, and she had buried it so deep that most days she could almost believe it was gone. But an engagement ring on Sabrina Whitfield's finger was a line she would not stand behind and applaud. She had too much pride for that, and, more importantly, she had too much sense. Norah picked up the crystal tumbler from the side table and poured 2 fingers of the Macallan that Declan kept only for himself. She drank it neat, and it burned a clean path down her throat and settled into a warm knot beneath her sternum. She had spent the last 2 days doing what she did best, which was disappearing a problem. She had wiped her personal digital footprint down to nothing. She had liquidated the accounts that existed only in her head and on paper the family did not know about. She had secured a new name and a new set of documents through a contact in Montreal who owed her a debt she had been saving for exactly this kind of night. There was a single bag packed in the trunk of her car in the garage below, enough clothing for a week, and nothing sentimental, because sentiment was weight, and weight got people caught. All she had to do now was sign the letter, place it in the center of the desk where he would find it, and walk out the service entrance before the toast. No 2 weeks of notice. You did not give notice to men like Declan Kane. You either died or you vanished, and Norah had chosen, for the first time in 5 years, to choose herself. She set the empty glass down with a soft click of crystal on wood. She smoothed the front of her dark gray dress, a color chosen so that she would fade into the shadows of the ballroom if anyone thought to look for her, and then she picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake this time. She signed her name in a small, precise hand, the letters as controlled as everything else about her, and for one strange moment she felt nothing at all, only the enormous quiet of a decision finally made. Then she reached for her trench coat where it lay folded over the arm of the leather sofa, the sofa where she had sometimes fallen asleep waiting out a storm or a shipment or the slow grinding hours after violence, and she slid her arms into the sleeves and tied the belt tight against the chill that lived in this room, even in summer. She lifted her leather tote onto her shoulder. She looked one last time at the letter on the desk, at the seascape on the wall, at the window with its groaning floorboard and its view of a city she had helped a dangerous family hold in the palm of its hand, and she told herself that she felt only relief. She crossed to the heavy oak door and wrapped her fingers around the cool brass of the handle and turned it, and the door pushed back against her before it had opened even an inch, because someone was standing on the other side. The door swung inward with a slow, deliberate weight, and Declan Kane filled the frame the way a storm fills a horizon. He was dressed for his own engagement in a charcoal tuxedo that fit him the way armor fits a knight, though the bow tie hung undone around his open collar and the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were loose, offering a glimpse of the dark ink that climbed from his chest toward his collarbone. He did not look like a man celebrating anything. He looked like a wolf that had caught the scent of blood on the snow and followed it up 3 flights of stairs to find the wound. His eyes, that pale gray that could go flat and cold as harbor ice, moved over her in a single unhurried pass, the trench coat tied tight at her waist, the tote on her shoulder, the flat, quiet shoes, and then past her to the cream-colored sheet of paper resting in the center of his blotter. Something in his jaw shifted, a small muscle feathering near his ear, the only crack in an otherwise perfect stillness. He stepped fully into the office, and without ever taking his eyes from her, he reached back with one hand and pushed the heavy door shut, and then he turned the deadbolt with a slow twist of his wrist so that it settled home with a sound like a gavel coming down in an empty courtroom. "You're not going anywhere," he said, and his voice was gravel and smoke, low and terrifyingly even, the voice he used in the last quiet moment before something in a warehouse got broken. Norah did not step back, though every instinct honed over 5 years told her to put distance between herself and a man in this mood. She lifted her chin instead and kept her own voice level, the clinical calm she had built like a wall around herself. "My shift is over, Mr. Kane," she said, and she watched the formality land on him like a small cruelty, because she had not called him that in private for years. "I left the necessary paperwork on your desk. The handover protocols are encrypted and the access keys are in the safe. You'll find everything in order." He crossed the Persian rug toward the desk, unhurried, moving with the deliberate grace of a predator that already knows every exit is sealed, and he picked up the letter and held it without reading it, his eyes still on her face. "Everything in order," he repeated softly, as though the words were a joke he did not find funny. "You think this is about the encryption. You think I care about the access keys, about the ledgers, about whether the handover is clean." He let the paper hang from his fingers. "Downstairs, the mayor is raising a glass to my future. Half the men in that ballroom would put a bullet in the back of my head if they thought they could survive the aftermath. And I came up here for 2 minutes of quiet, and instead I find my accountant wearing a coat." "It's raining," Norah said. "You hate the rain. You wait it out on the sofa. Sometimes you fall asleep there, and I have to send Sam to drive you home at 2 in the morning." He set the letter down. "So tell me where you're going." "Away," she said, and she used his given name then, the name she reserved for the moments after the bleeding stopped, when the adrenaline crashed and there was no one left in the room but the two of them and whatever this was that neither of them would name. "Away, Declan." His fingers closed around the letter and crushed it slowly into a tight ball, the sound of the heavy paper collapsing, absurdly loud in the still air, and then he tossed it into the brass wastebasket beside the desk, where it landed with a small, hollow knock. "Declined," he said. Her spine went rigid. "It isn't a request. It's a notification. The family charter allows any employee without a blood oath to sever ties, provided they surrender their assets and their knowledge intact. I have surrendered both. I am walking out with the clothes on my back and nothing else, exactly as the rules I helped you write permit." "The rules," he said, and something violent moved beneath the calm, a fault line shifting. "You think I give a damn about the charter. You have been reading me those protocols for 5 years like scripture, and you think I keep you because you know the protocols. Then why do you keep me?" She asked, and her own control frayed at last, the ice cracking to show the black water underneath. "You have your alliance. You have the Whitfield shipping lanes and the political cover, and a beautiful bride who will smile for the cameras and pour tea for the wives of men who want you dead. What possible use do you have for a shadow in the corner of the room? Is that what you think you are?" "I know what I am," she said. "I am the woman who scrubs the accounts and schedules the payoffs and lies to federal agents with a straight face. I am very good at what I do, and my work here is finished." "It is not finished. She is wearing your ring, Declan." The words came out of her before she could stop them, tasting of copper and shame, and she hated herself for the crack in her armor that let them escape, hated that he had heard the true thing underneath all the clean professional language. He went utterly still, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the distant, muffled pulse of the string quartet 3 floors below. Then he crossed the last of the distance between them, and his hand came up and cupped the side of her jaw, his palm hot against her cold skin, his thumb brushing the corner of her eye as though to catch a tear she was refusing to shed. "The marriage is a piece of paper," he said, and his voice had dropped to something rougher, something almost pleading beneath the command. just like the one you tried to leave on my desk. Arthur Whitfield came to me 2 months ago with a proposal and an unspoken threat behind it. His people were moving on our territory from 3 directions at once, and he had cover I could not see the shape of, and if I had refused him, we would have been at war by the first frost, a war we would not survive. I took the merger to buy peace. I took it to keep this family breathing. I took it to keep you breathing, because you would have been the first name on their list, and do not tell me you don't know that. You didn't consult me, she said, and now the tears were real, and she let one fall, because there was no longer any point in pretending. You didn't warn me. I found out about the engagement when the invoice for the ring crossed my desk. I paid for it, Declan. I paid for it out of the discretionary account with my own hands. Do you have any idea what that felt like? He flinched as though she had struck him, and his hand fell away from her face. I couldn't tell you, he said, low and rough, looking not at her, but at the window and the rain-slicked city beyond it. Because if I had looked you in the eye and told you I was going to marry another woman to keep us alive, I would not have gone through with it. I would have put an end to Arthur Whitfield myself and damned every one of us to the fire. So I made the play, and I kept my mouth shut, and I let you find out the coward's way, and I have hated myself for it every hour since. Norah reached up and closed her hand around his wrist and drew it away from her, gently, the way you disarm something dangerous. Unlock the door, she said, and the fight had drained out of her voice, leaving only exhaustion. Let me go. He looked at her for a long, unbearable moment, and then the vulnerability folded away behind the impenetrable mask of the man who ran half the city, and he adjusted his cuff and stepped past her and turned the deadbolt with a sharp, echoing snap and pulled the door wide. Fix your face, he said, his tone sliding back into absolute authority, though his eyes betrayed him. Then come downstairs. We have a party to survive. He walked out and left the door standing open, and Norah stood alone against the frame, and in the brass wastebasket beside the desk, the crumpled letter sat where he had thrown it, unburned, waiting. The ballroom was a gilded cage of chandeliers and beautiful lies, and Norah moved back into it the way she always did, along the eastern wall, where the shadow of a marble pillar swallowed her gray dress and made her one more piece of the architecture. 400 of the most dangerous and influential people in Boston milled across the polished floor in their silks and their tailored wool, pretending they were something other than what they were, and the string quartet in the far corner played on beneath the low roar of laughter and threats disguised as small talk. She had fixed her face in the powder room off the landing, wiped away the single tear, and reapplied the neutral armor of her makeup, and told her reflection that the conversation upstairs had changed nothing, and her reflection had not believed her either. From her place against the pillar she could see everything, the main entrance, the service doors, the small raised dais where the family received its guests, and she watched Declan hold court at the center of the room with a glass of untouched champagne in his hand and a smile that touched his mouth but never once reached his eyes. On his arm, luminous in ivory silk, stood Sabrina Whitfield. The younger woman was undeniably lovely, all soft blonde waves and old money ease, the kind of effortless grace that a woman who had clawed her way up from nothing could study for a lifetime and never quite counterfeit. And on her finger, the enormous diamond caught the chandelier light and threw it back in cold white sparks. Norah looked down at the tablet in her hand and swiped through nothing at all, anchoring herself to the familiar glass and data, and she told herself not to look. And then she looked anyway, and across 50 feet of crowded marble, Declan's gray eyes lifted from something Arthur Whitfield was saying and found her in her shadow and held her there for 3 full seconds before she made herself sever the connection and turn away. You must be the one who actually runs this family. The voice came from her left, smooth and unhurried, and Norah turned to find a tall man in a beautifully cut navy suit standing a polite distance away, holding 2 flutes of champagne and wearing the kind of symmetrical, agreeable face that belonged to actors and, in her experience, to federal agents. She catalogued him in the space of a breath, the expensive watch, the confident stillness, the fact that she did not recognize him from any file. Julian Voss, he said, offering her one of the glasses, which she did not take. I came in with the Whitfield party. I have to tell you, I have read a great deal about the way you restructured the cane supply chains after the harbor was raided last year. It was elegant work, almost invisible. The praise landed like a cold hand at the base of her spine, because the restructuring he described had been buried under so many layers of dummy corporations that no one outside of Declan, herself, and two men who were now permanently unavailable should have known it existed. She kept her expression smooth and blank. You have me confused with someone important, Mr. Voss. I handle logistics for a development company. Of course you do, he said, and he sipped his own champagne and let his gaze drift toward Declan and Sabrina on the dais. And that is a great love story blooming right there in front of God and the mayor. It is a beautiful piece of theater. But theaters burn down, Miss Vance, especially when the leading man is so distracted by the woman standing in the shadows that he cannot see the fire being laid under the stage. Norah did not let her eyes move toward Declan. If you have a point, make it. I have a party to keep running. Julian stepped a fraction closer, and his voice dropped beneath the music into something almost gentle. The point is that the Whitfields did not come here to share a table. They came to consume it from the inside, and the man you work for believes he has bought himself a peace when what he has actually done is open the gates and wave the horse through. When it all comes apart, and it will come apart very soon, a woman with your particular talents should not be standing on the losing side of the board. He reached into his jacket and produced a matte black card with nothing on it but a phone number embossed in blind lettering, and he slipped it into the outer pocket of her tablet case before she could refuse it. When you are ready to actually leave, he said, and not just write a letter about it, call that number. People who appreciate your work would be glad to have you. He gave her a small, courteous nod and melted back into the crowd before she could form a single word, and she stood alone against the pillar, with her heart striking hard against her ribs, staring at the space where he had been, understanding all at once that the alliance she had been mourning was not an alliance at all, but a slaughter waiting for its hour, and that whoever these people were, they already knew her name, and they knew she was the hinge the whole door swung on. The comms channel in her ear crackled, and it was not Sam's voice but Declan's, low and clipped, a man who had watched a stranger lean too close to something that belonged to him. My office. 5 minutes. She looked across the room and saw him already extracting himself from the circle of men, Sabrina's manicured hand sliding from his arm with a practiced smile that did not slow him down, and she pressed the button at her lapel and murmured that she copied, and she went. He was waiting when she came through the door, and the moment the deadbolt turned, he was on her, not with his hands but with the full weight of his attention, and his voice was dangerously quiet. Who was he? Not a question. She set her tablet on the desk and answered flatly, the way she answered everything, because the clinical calm was the only thing keeping her upright. Julian Voss. He came with the Whitfield party. He knew exactly who I am, and exactly what I do for you, down to the harbor restructuring, which means someone on their side has been reading files they should not be able to touch. He touched you, Declan said, and the jealousy in it was raw and undisguised, the mask gone entirely. I watched him lean into you and put his hand near you, and I watched you stand there and let him. I was assessing a threat, she said, and you are angry about precisely the wrong thing. Then tell me the right thing to be angry about. She pulled the black card from her case and dropped it on the blotter next to the wastebasket, where her crumpled letter still sat. He didn't offer me a job, Declan. He offered me a lifeboat. He called your marriage a Trojan horse, and he told me the Whitfields are not here to share power, they are here to hollow it out from the inside, and he wanted me on their side before the killing starts. The fury drained out of his posture, and was replaced instantly by the cold calculation of the man who had survived the bloody years of his father's reign, and he stared down at the black card without touching it. If Voss knows you are the hinge, he said slowly, then Arthur Whitfield knows. Which means they are not planning a simple hit. They are mapping the whole machine, the routes, the judges, the accounts. They want the throne intact. He looked up at her, and something in his face changed, softened into an unwelcome tenderness. Why did you tell me? You wanted out. You had the letter written and the bag packed. He handed you a clean exit with a new employer and a chance to watch me burn from a safe distance. Why come up here and warn me? Norah looked at the wastebasket, at the small crushed ball of paper, and she found she did not have a clean answer, so she gave him a true one instead. Because I built this with you. I scrubbed the rot out of your father's books with my own hands. Whoever these people are, they do not get to take my work, and they do not get to take you. The words hung between them, heavier than she had intended, and to break their weight, she reached for the professional again, for the data. There's something else. When Voss was talking, he referred to the family behind all of this as Whitfield Shipping. She had said the name 100 times in the last 2 months, and it had meant nothing. Only a shipping concern, only the vehicle of the merger. But standing here now with the adrenaline stripping away 5 years of careful forgetting, the name struck a different note, an old note, a note from a life she had buried. Declan, she said slowly, when you hired me, you read my file. You know about my father. He nodded once, carefully, because they had never spoken of it aloud in 5 years. He owned a small construction firm. He was ruined. He took his own life when I was 19. I know. The firm didn't just fail, she said, and her voice had gone strange and quiet. A creditor bought up his debt in the last year and called it all at once and squeezed him until there was nothing left, and I was too young and too broken to ever find out who was behind the holding company that did it. I spent years telling myself it didn't matter who. She looked at the black card on the desk, then at nothing at all, her forensic mind already beginning to move down a corridor she had kept locked for 8 years. I never once connected the name, because I never had a reason to look. But the shape of it is the same. The method is the same. Declan took a step toward her. Norah, I'm not saying anything yet, she said, lifting a hand, her control snapping back into place like a door closing. I could be wrong. It's a common enough way to kill a company, and there are 100 firms that do it. But I need to check something before I say another word. She picked up her tablet and slid the black card into her case beside the memory of everything she had spent 5 years refusing to feel, and she looked at the man she had come here tonight to leave forever. Give me full access to the wedding accounts. Every vendor the Whitfields requested, every invoice they submitted, every dollar that moved. I need to check one thing, and if I am right about it, then this was never a merger at all. The Kane data operation ran out of a nondescript brick building near the old rail yards that presented itself to the world as a failing textile importer. And by 2 in the morning, Norah sat alone in the blue glow of 3 monitors, with a cold cup of black coffee forgotten at her elbow and the whole engagement party a distant memory. Declan had given her total access, and she had not gone anywhere near the obvious assets, the container yards and the parking concerns, and the 2 restaurants that anyone auditing the Whitfields would look at first, because Arthur Whitfield was far too careful to leave a trail where the light already fell. She looked instead at the wedding. The Whitfields had insisted, as a gesture of goodwill and a merging of 2 families' resources, on handling the catering and the florals, and above all the security for the ceremony to come, and it was into that generosity that Norah now poured every skill she had spent a lifetime sharpening. She pulled the incorporation records for the holding company that had ruined her father 8 years ago, the one whose name she had buried so deep she had needed an hour just to remember where to dig, and she ran its old routing data against the corporate genealogy of Whitfield Shipping, and she watched the connection resolve on the center screen with a slow, sickening certainty. The firm that had bought her father's debt and called it all in a single afternoon and squeezed him until there was nothing left of him but a note and a folded coat, had not been some faceless vulture fund after all. It had been a subsidiary of a subsidiary, 3 shells deep, and at the bottom of the stack, holding the whole thing up, sat Arthur Whitfield's private investment arm. The past she had spent 8 years refusing to look at and the danger closing around Declan tonight were not 2 separate things. They were the same enemy wearing 2 different suits, and the man who had killed her father was the same man who now sat smiling at the head of the table, and his daughter was wearing the ring. Norah sat with that for a long moment, her clean, steady hands flat on the desk, and she did not let herself feel it yet, because there was still work to do, and grief was weight, and weight got people killed. She kept digging. She pulled the vendor contracts for the wedding, and she followed the money for the security arrangement Sabrina had personally recommended, a firm called Crescent Event Security that Chloe would have said was the very best in the city, and she ran the wire transfers backward through their metadata the way she had taught herself to do a decade ago. The funds did not come from the Whitfield operating accounts. They came from the Sabrina Whitfield Foundation, the young woman's own charity, the harmless little vehicle for gala photographs and children's hospital checks, and the moment Norah saw that, she understood that Sabrina was not a pawn in any of this. The foundation had underwritten the entire contract for Crescent Event Security, and when Norah forced her way into Crescent's own corporate filings, she found what she had known in her gut she would find: a registered agent whose name appeared on a federal roster, a shell whose true purpose was not to guard a wedding, but to place trained federal personnel inside Declan Kane's most private circle on the one night every capo and underboss and bought judge in the organization would be gathered under a single roof. The wedding was never a merger, and it was never even only a takeover. It was a Trojan horse, built to carry the Department of Justice straight through the gates, and Sabrina, sweet Kamchu Sabrina with her charity and her soft blonde waves, had drafted the blueprints herself and signed them with her own foundation's money. Norah pulled her encrypted phone from the desk and called Declan and told him all of it in a flat, rapid voice that did not shake: the debt that had killed her father and the man who had held it, the foundation and Crescent and the federal roster, the fact that his bride was not a victim but the architect, and she heard him go very quiet on the other end of the line, the quiet of a man recalculating every assumption he had made in the last 2 months, and she told him they were out of time. Across the city, in the study of the Whitfield estate high in the hills, Julian Voss set down his own phone and understood that the timeline had just collapsed. He had watched Norah Vance's face at the party when he made his offer, and he had told himself she was the kind of woman who would take a week to decide and then take the lifeboat, because women who wrote resignation letters and packed their bags in secret were women looking for a way out. But the analysts monitoring the Crescent shells had flagged an intrusion 2 hours ago, a quiet, surgical query that had slipped under the federal firewall through the accounting software and pulled the registered agent's true affiliation before anyone could sever the connection, and there was only one person on the board with the skill and the access to do that. She had not taken the lifeboat. She had gone straight for the hull of their ship with a drill. Julian climbed the stairs and knocked once and let himself into the room where Arthur Whitfield sat with a glass of brandy and the patience of a man who had spent 3 years feeding secrets to the government in exchange for his own immunity, and he told the older man that the accountant was inside the operation and that the entire long game, the wedding and the informants and the slow hollowing out of the Kane family from within, was about to be exposed before it could ever be sprung. Arthur Whitfield did not raise his voice. He simply asked how long they had, and Julian said hours, perhaps less, and the older man set down his brandy and said that in that case, the elegant plan was finished, and the crude one would have to do. If they could not take the throne intact, then they would take the man off it directly, tonight, before he could act on whatever his accountant had found, and they would deal with the woman afterward. The order went out through channels that did not touch a single federal wire. Somewhere near the harbor, a call was made to Declan's private line, a voice he trusted with a message about a shipment gone wrong and a union boss who needed to be met at once, the kind of routine midnight fire that Declan had put out 100 times, and he took Sam Doyle in the armored Lincoln and drove out to Pier 44 in Charlestown without a second thought, because the trap had been baited with the one thing a careful man never questions: an ordinary problem. He did not answer when Norah called him back 20 minutes later to add one more piece she had found. He did not answer the second call, or the third. Declan Kane never went dark without telling her, not in 5 years, and the silence on the line turned the cold, professional calm in her chest into something sharp and animal, and she opened the tracking system she managed for exactly this reason and watched a single red point blink to life on the map at the Charlestown docks, at a berth where no honest meeting was ever held at 3:30 in the morning, and she was already running for her car before the map had finished loading. The fog came off the harbor thick and yellow under the sodium lights when Norah brought her car screaming around the last stack of rusted containers, and she heard the ambush before she saw it, the flat, concussive cracks rolling across the corrugated steel, the deeper answer of a pistol fired in disciplined bursts. Declan and Sam had been driven into a killing box, 3 shooters up on the catwalks of the loading cranes, and more of them advancing on foot through the shadows between the containers. And the armored Lincoln sat pinned in the open with its windows spidered white and its quarter panels torn open. And even as she took it all in, she saw Sam Doyle spin and go down hard behind the engine block, a dark stain blooming at his shoulder, and she saw Declan drag the wounded man into cover with one arm, while returning fire with the other, trapped, out of angles, a man who had run out of exits at last. Norah did not slow down. She did not calculate the odds or weigh her own survival against his, because there was no version of the arithmetic that ended with her turning around, and everything she had spent 5 years building, the flat calm, the steady hands, the careful distance, fell away in a single instant and left only the truth underneath it, which was that 36 hours ago she had written her name on a letter meant to carry her out of his life forever, and that letter was still sitting crumpled and unburned in a wastebasket across the city, and she had never once, not for a single hour, actually wanted to be gone. She drove her car, an ordinary sedan with no armor and no cover, straight into the mouth of the killing box and slammed it broadside between the advancing shooters and the ruined Lincoln. And the rear glass came apart in a rain of pebbled safety glass across the leather seats, and she threw the passenger door open and screamed his name into the roar. Declan moved without hesitation, hauling Sam up by his belt and shoving the half-conscious man into the back seat. And then he was in beside her with the door not yet closed as she jammed the car into reverse and hauled it around in a shrieking, fishtailing arc that pressed him hard against the door, and a round punched clean through the side mirror a hand's breadth from his head. She killed the lights and drove blind into the dark corridor between the containers, on nothing but the pale wash of the moon through the fog, her knuckles white on the wheel, her whole body one taut wire, and she told him in a voice torn ragged by adrenaline that they were federal, that the Whitfields had flipped, that the whole marriage had been a sting from the first handshake, and Sabrina had built it, and Arthur had ordered this the moment he learned she was inside their files. Declan stared at her profile in the glow of the dashboard, at the glass caught in her auburn hair and the thin cut bleeding slow across her cheek, and he said, strangely calm beneath the chaos, that she had driven an unarmored car into a crossfire for him, and she snapped back that he had not answered his phone. And she took the service road out through the south gate at a speed that bottomed the suspension against the rutted dirt and burst them through a chain-link fence and out onto the empty industrial highway, with the docks and the gunfire falling away into the fog behind them. Only when they were miles clear, with Sam breathing shallow but steady in the back seat and the bleeding slowed under the pressure of Declan's folded coat, did she let the car drift onto the gravel shoulder beneath a flickering overpass light and put it in park with the engine still running, and only then did her hands, those hands she had trained for 3 years never to betray her, finally begin to shake. Declan reached across the center console and took her shaking hands in both of his, hands still smeared with Sam's blood, and he held them still against the trembling until the shaking slowed under the sheer heat and pressure of his grip. Norah finally turned her head and looked at him, and her eyes were bright with tears she had refused to let fall for 5 years, and the full weight of how close she had come to losing him tonight was written plainly across a face she usually kept as unreadable as a locked ledger. "You are an idiot," she whispered, her voice cracking down the middle. "You drove straight into it. You didn't even look," and he answered softly that he had, and that she had come and pulled him out anyway, and she told him it was because he was her boss, and she managed the assets. The old lie, the professional armor she reached for out of habit even now, with glass in her hair and a bullet hole in the door beside his head. "Shut up," Declan breathed, and he leaned across the narrow space between them and kissed her, and it was nothing gentle, nothing careful. It was the collision of 5 years of everything neither of them had ever been permitted to say, desperate and bruising and tasting of copper and cold night air and cordite. And Norah made a small broken sound against his mouth and let go of every rule she had ever written for herself, her hands coming up to fist in the ruined lapels of his coat and pull him closer instead of pushing him away for the first time in half a decade. When he finally drew back, he did not go far, keeping his forehead pressed to hers, both of them breathing hard in the sudden thick heat of the freezing car, and she could feel his pulse where her fingers still gripped his collar, hammering as fast and as hard as her own. "The engagement is finished," he said against her lips, his voice low and absolutely certain. "There is no merger. There is no peace to buy. There was never anything to buy. Only a rope they were measuring for my neck, and I am done pretending otherwise. Sabrina Whitfield will never wear my name, and her father will never again sit at my table as a friend." Norah opened her eyes and looked at him from a distance of nothing at all, and the fear that had gripped her since the docks had burned away entirely, replaced by something colder and clearer and far more dangerous, the same fault line of fury she had kept sealed for 8 years finally cracking open in the dark. "The man who ordered this tonight," she said slowly, "is the same man who killed my father. He didn't just try to take you, he took everything I had before I was old enough to fight back. And he has been sitting in that house on the hill for 8 years, thinking no one would ever find the thread and pull it." Declan's thumb moved across the cut on her cheek, wiping away a smear of blood, and he studied her face and saw the thing that had woken in it, and he did not try to soothe it. "Then we finish him," he said quietly. "Not a warning shot, not a truce. We take the whole thing down to the foundation and salt the ground." She held his gaze, and there was no hesitation left anywhere in her, no letter in a wastebasket, no bag in a trunk, no exit she was saving for herself. "Good," Norah said. "Let's go to war." The clinic beneath the shuttered veterinary practice smelled of bleach and iron and old coffee, and it was reached, as it had always been reached, through a freight elevator that groaned on its cables like something wounded, and by the time Norah brought the ruined car down the ramp and killed the engine, Sam Doyle had gone gray and quiet in the back seat, though his chest still rose and fell in the shallow, stubborn rhythm of a man too proud to die on someone else's schedule. Dr. Harris was already scrubbing in when they carried him through, a former trauma surgeon who had lost his license to a habit a decade ago and found, in the Kane organization, a place where his hands still mattered and no one asked him questions he did not want to answer. And he worked in silence over the torn shoulder with fingers as steady as a metronome, digging out what the night had put there and telling Declan, without looking up, that the man would keep the arm and in time the use of it, that the round had missed the artery by the width of a prayer. Norah stood at the aluminum sink in the corner and ran the water cold over her hands and scrubbed at them with a stiff brush, watching the pale pink swirl away down the drain, and the blood was not hers, and it was not Declan's. It was Sam's, and yet it felt as though it were seeping into the lines of her own palms, into the creases she had kept so clean and so controlled for 5 years, and she scrubbed harder, as if she could take a layer of the night off with the skin. "You are going to take your hand off at this rate," Declan said quietly, and then he was behind her, and he reached around and closed his own hands over her wrists, not pulling them from the water, but simply stopping the frantic motion of them, and he took the brush out of her white-knuckled grip and set it in the basin and pumped a measure of the harsh industrial soap into his own palm. And slowly, methodically, he began to wash the blood from her hands himself, working the lather between her fingers and over her knuckles and into the lines of her palms, his thumbs pressing small, steady circles against the places where the tremor still lived. The sheer, terrifying intimacy of it closed her throat, the head of the Kane family standing at a basement sink washing the night off the hands of the woman who kept his secrets, and she made herself breathe, and she let him do it, because she had spent 5 years being the one who cleaned up after everyone else, and she did not have the first idea how to be cleaned up after, and she was learning, in the space of a single night, a great many things she had sworn she would never let herself learn. He turned the tap off and dried her hands on a rough paper towel with the same deliberate care, ignoring the blood still drying on his own cuffs, and then he turned her around to face him under the unforgiving fluorescent light that carved hollows beneath his eyes, and caught the grease on his jaw and the still vibrating energy in his heavy frame, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "The kiss in the car," she started, reaching for the pragmatic, the way a drowning person reaches for a rope. "We cannot let it. We do not have time. By dawn, the federal side will understand their sting is compromised, and the Whitfields will move again." And he crowded her gently back against the edge of the sink and told her that he was more focused than he had been in months. That the engagement had been a strategy to prevent a war, and the war had arrived, and the strategy was therefore finished, and that he needed her now not as the woman he had spent 5 years failing to reach across a locked distance, but as the sharpest mind he had ever worked beside. "So tell me," he said, "how we win." And Norah felt the fear and the fury and the impossible tenderness of the last hours settle, all at once, into the cold, clear thing she was best at, the thing that had made Declan Cain pull her out of a basement full of other men's crimes 5 years ago, which was the ability to look at an enemy's machine and see exactly where it would break. "Arthur Whitfield is a protected federal informant," she said, thinking aloud, her eyes losing focus as the board assembled itself in her mind. "If you put him in the ground, the Department of Justice comes down on this city like a flood. They will use the RICO statutes, and they will not stop at you. They will take the whole organization apart, brick by brick, and we do not have the political weight to survive a federal siege, not after tonight. So we do not touch him," Declan said. "No," she agreed slowly, and then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something colder and more precise. "We do not need to touch him. Arthur has stayed alive for 3 years for exactly one reason, and it is the same reason he is dangerous. His value to the government is his access, his ability to deliver the men he does business with, the shipping networks, the distribution, the people who do not answer to any commission and do not believe in courtrooms. He has been selling those men to the Department of Justice one secret at a time, and the only thing keeping him breathing is that those men still believe he is loyal." Declan understood it before she had finished, the cold logic of it, and something like admiration moved across his hard face. "If the people he informs on learn that he is the informant," he said. "Then they attend to him themselves," Norah finished, "and they do it long before any grand jury is ever convened, and when the government's star witness is gone, the case against us collapses under its own weight before it reaches a single judge, and the best part, the part that makes it clean, is that we never lift a hand. We only make certain the right people read his file." "How long?" Declan asked, and she looked at the clock on the clinic wall, the hands crawling toward the gray edge of morning, and she said she needed a sterile terminal and a hard line that bypassed the local exchange, and that she could have it done before the city woke. He nodded once and stepped back and became, in the space of a breath, the man who ran half of Boston, issuing the address of the safe house near the rail yards, and then he paused at the heavy steel door and looked back at her, and for a moment the boss vanished, and only the man remained, the one who had kissed her in a car full of broken glass. "And you?" she said, because she had already read the other half of the plan in the set of his shoulders. He would go to the estate in the hills, he told her, where Julian Voss and Sabrina would be waiting for the phone call that confirmed he had died at the docks, and he would deliver the news of his survival in person while the file did its work. "Voss is not a street soldier," she warned him. "He is trained. He is a federal handler. Do not walk in there thinking he is one of your capos." "So am I trained," Declan said flatly, and then, more quietly, the thing that was underneath all of it. "Do not miss, Norah. Burn every copy of that file into the ground, and make certain the men in Juarez have it in their hands before Arthur ever knows the wind has changed." And Norah looked at the man she had come, 5 nights ago, to leave forever, and at the gun already sliding into the holster beneath his arm, and she found that the woman who had packed a bag and secured a false name and kept an exit ready in her back pocket was simply gone, burned away somewhere on a fog-choked pier between one heartbeat and the next, and what stood in her place was someone who had stopped planning her escape and started planning his enemy's ruin. "Do not die, Declan," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "I am not training a new boss." He almost smiled, and then the steel door closed behind him, and she turned back to the terminal in the corner and cracked her clean, still trembling knuckles once, and went to work. The safe house was a stripped concrete apartment on the top floor of a half-abandoned building near the rail yards. No heat, no furniture but a folding table and a chair, but a fiber line spliced straight into the city's main trunk, and by the time the sky outside had begun to bleed from black to a bruised, heavy gray, Norah had been working for hours without once looking up. She was not simply breaking into the federal system, she was performing surgery on it, sliding beneath the firewall the same way she had slipped in earlier. Not by force, but through the soft, bureaucratic underside where the accounting software met the case management portal, following the trail of Arthur Whitfield's immunity arrangement through layer after layer of sealed filings. What she found was the anatomy of a betrayal 3 years in the making, audio transcripts in which Arthur named names, signed affidavits detailing the shipping routes and the distribution networks, and the men who ran them, the entire architecture of his cooperation with the government, laid out in his own words and bearing his own digital signature, because a rat is only valuable to his handlers so long as no one else knows he is a rat, and Arthur Whitfield had stayed alive and free for 3 years for exactly one reason, which was that the extremely dangerous people whose secrets he had been selling still believed he was one of them. Norah understood the machine she was looking at with perfect clarity, because it was the same kind of machine she had spent her whole life taking apart, and she understood that she did not need to raise a hand against Arthur Whitfield at all. She only needed to let the right people read his file. She compiled the evidence into a single encrypted package, the transcripts and the affidavits and the routing data, everything that proved beyond any argument that the man who had ruined her father and ordered Declan's death was also the man who had spent 3 years feeding his own partners to the Department of Justice. And she attached a short message in flawless Spanish, "The dog bites the hand that feeds it," and she sent it through the private channels used by the intelligence arm of the Gulf network Arthur had been informing on, the men who did not wait for grand juries and did not believe in subpoenas. She hovered over the final command for one long moment, aware that pressing it was the same as signing a death warrant for a man she had dined beside a week earlier, and then she thought of a folded coat and a note and a girl of 19 with no one left in the world, and she thought of Sam Doyle bleeding in the back seat and a bullet hole a hand's breadth from Declan's head, and she pressed it, and the payload was gone. While she worked, Declan moved on the estate in the hills the way water moves through a broken dam, quiet and total, leaving his strike team at the base of the drive because this last part was not business but something older, and he came in through the pine woods at the rear and past the perimeter men without a sound and let himself into the house through a terrace door whose alarm Norah had disabled from the safe house with a single keystroke the moment he texted that he was in position. He found them in Arthur's study, Julian Voss standing at the desk with a phone to his ear, and Sabrina on the velvet sofa still in the ivory she had worn to her own engagement. And he did not offer a monologue, and he did not gloat. He simply made it unmistakably clear who now controlled the room. Voss reached for the weapon at his hip, and Declan was faster, and the federal handler went down clutching a shattered knee, and understood in that instant that whatever protection his badge had promised him was very far away and would not arrive in time. Sabrina pressed herself into the corner of the sofa, all the soft blonde helplessness gone, replaced by the cold recognition of a strategist watching her own plan collapse, and she began to say that it had all been her father, that she had known nothing, and Declan did not even look at her. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed and set it on the desk on speaker, and Norah's voice came through the small tinny speaker into that beautiful ruined room, calm and exhausted and final. "The Gulf servers have confirmed receipt," she said. "It's done, Declan. Every file Arthur ever gave the government is now in the hands of the men he informed on." The color left Julian Voss's face entirely. He whispered that she could not possibly have breached the federal server, and Declan told him that she could do a great many things, that his star witness was at this moment being hunted by people who used far cruder instruments than paperwork, and that the case against the Kane family had died the moment that payload was sent, because there would very soon be no witness left alive to testify. He turned at last to Sabrina and told her to take the ring off, and she pulled the enormous diamond over her knuckle with trembling hands and let it drop to the floor, where it rolled to a stop against the leg of the desk. And Declan told her that if she or her father were within the city limits when the sun finished rising, he would not need to lift a finger against either of them, because the men now reading Arthur's file would attend to it far more thoroughly than he ever could, and then he walked out into the cold gray morning and left them to run. By the middle of the following day, it was as though a fever had broken over the whole city and left nothing behind but the strange clarity that follows. Arthur Whitfield was found in a motel far to the south, the victim, the papers would eventually say, of what appeared to be a settling of accounts among associates in a business the authorities had never fully mapped, and with their central informant gone, the federal task force that had been quietly built around the wedding simply dissolved, its months of work rendered useless overnight, its remaining paperwork buried by a department with no appetite for the scandal of having run a compromised operation through a compromised asset. Julian Voss vanished into a hospital and then into the anonymous machinery of a bureau that protected its own by forgetting them, permanently marked by the ruin of his knee and by the far deeper injury of having failed, and no charge he might have filed against the Kane family could survive without the case the informant had been building, so no charge was ever filed. Sabrina Whitfield was gone before the sun cleared the harbor, her name struck from every guest list that had fought to include it a week before, her foundation quietly wound down amid rumors no one could quite source. A woman who had gambled an empire on a plan that required her to be underestimated and had lost the moment a single accountant in a gray dress refused to be. The alliance that was to have redrawn the map of the city was simply erased, as if it had never been proposed, and the men who had toasted Declan's future at the party now made careful, respectful inquiries about his health and offered, through the appropriate intermediaries, their congratulations on his good fortune in having avoided so unsuitable a match. Sam Doyle came through the surgery in the clinic beneath the old veterinary practice and would keep the arm and, in time, the full use of it, and he told anyone who would listen, in the weeks that followed, that he had never in his life expected to be pulled out of a killing box by the woman who kept the books. The Kane organization emerged not weakened but consolidated, its enemies scattered and its throne secure, no soldiers lost to a war that had ended before it could truly begin, no federal indictment hanging over any of it, only the quiet understanding among everyone who mattered that whoever had tried to move against Declan Kane had made a catastrophic and unrepeatable mistake. The war was over before it had ever reached the morning papers, and the city went on turning as if nothing had happened at all, which was, Norah reflected, exactly how the most important things always happened, in the silence between the numbers, where only she had ever thought to look. 2 evenings later, the office at the top of the Beacon Hill house was quiet again, the bullet-scarred Lincoln already repaired and returned to the garage, the rain once more sliding down the tall windows and washing the last of the week from the streets below, and Norah stood where she had stood on the night of the party, in the center of the Persian rug, in a sharp charcoal suit this time instead of a dress meant for disappearing, the thin cut on her cheek healed to a pale line she no longer bothered to hide. The heavy oak door opened, and Declan came in and turned the deadbolt behind him with the same slow twist of the wrist he had used to seal her in 5 nights ago, except that this time the sound of it did not feel like a cage closing, and he crossed to the desk and reached down into the brass wastebasket that no one had emptied, and drew out the small crushed ball of heavy cream paper that had sat there through everything, through the party and the docks and the war, unburned, waiting. He did not smooth it open, and he did not read it. He took a slim silver lighter from his pocket and struck it, and he held the flame to the edge of her resignation until the paper caught and the fire ran up it, blackening the letters of her name, and he held it until the flame had nearly reached his fingers and then dropped the last burning scrap into the crystal ashtray on the desk and watched it curl into ash. "The family charter," he said, looking at her through the thin rising thread of smoke, "says that an operative may leave provided they surrender their assets and their knowledge." And Norah answered, softly, that she knew the charter, that she had written most of it, and he said good, because they were going to rewrite it. He came around the desk and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her face up to hold his eyes, and he told her that there would be no more shadows, no more standing against the pillar at the edge of the room while he held court, no more calling herself an asset or a shift or a job. "You drove an unarmored car into a crossfire for me," he said, his voice dropping into the low register that had undone her in the car. "You found the thread that had been hidden for 8 years, and you pulled it, and it unraveled an entire federal operation in a single night. You hold the ledgers, and you hold the secrets, and you hold this whole family upright with your own 2 hands, and somewhere in these 5 years you also came to hold me, and I am finished letting you pretend that you don't." Norah's breath caught, and the old reflex rose in her, the instinct to reach for the clinical distance, to say something about protocols, but she looked at the ash of her own letter in the crystal dish, and she let it go. "I am not your accountant anymore," she said, drawing the line herself this time. "No," Declan agreed, and he slid his hands to her waist and drew her flush against him. "You are my partner, my equal, the underboss of this family, if you want it, and no charter and no commission and no man alive will tell me otherwise." She warned him, even as her hands came up his chest, that the commission would never accept a woman in that seat, and he said, simply, that then they would deal with the commission, and it was not a joke, it was a promise, and she believed every word of it. He kissed her, and it was nothing like the desperate blood and cordite of the car. It was slow and deliberate and certain, a thing claimed rather than seized, and she kissed him back and poured into it every silent night, and every stolen glance, and every ounce of the ruthless, patient love she had guarded for 5 years. And when they finally parted, he kept his arms around her and rested his chin on the top of her head and looked out over the rain-washed city they would now hold together, and Norah leaned into the steady, strong beat of his heart and understood, at last, that she had spent 5 years building an exit she was never going to use. They stood like that for a long while as the rain traced its slow patterns down the tall windows, and when Norah finally lifted her face from his chest, she was the one who closed the last of the distance between them, rising to press her mouth to his in a kiss that asked for nothing and promised everything. A quiet sealing of a thing that had taken 5 years and a war and a single unburned letter to finally speak aloud, and Declan gathered her in and answered it, and in that room where she had once memorized every floorboard and every exit she found, that she was no longer counting the ways out, because for the first time in her life she had no intention of leaving. She thought, as she stood there in the circle of his arms with the ash of her own resignation cooling in the crystal dish beside them, of the girl she had been at 19, alone with a folded coat and a note and a grief too large to carry, and she understood at last that everything she had built in the years since, the flat calm, the steady hands, the packed bag, and the false name, and the exit always kept ready in her back pocket, had never been the armor of a weak woman, but the careful architecture of one who had learned too young exactly how much it costs to love something and lose it, and who had sworn she would never be caught unprepared again. She had kept an escape route from every room she ever entered, not because she was afraid to stay, but because she had already survived the one loss that teaches a person to always, always leave first. And what she learned in the space of 36 hours, in a bullet-scarred car on a fog-choked pier, and in a concrete room where she pulled an empire down with a keyboard, and in this quiet office where a man burned the last proof of her leaving, was that there comes a single moment in a guarded life when the thing you have spent years protecting your heart from becomes the only thing worth risking your heart for. And in that moment, the exit you have carefully kept ready your whole life means nothing at all, because you are no longer running toward the door, you are running toward the fire, and you do not hesitate, and you do not calculate, and you do not look back. Norah Vance had written her way out of Declan Kane's life in 2 clean sentences, and then she had driven straight into a hail of gunfire to save him without so much as a breath of doubt, and the distance between those 2 acts was the whole story of a woman finally choosing to be found. The smoke has cleared, the enemies are scattered, and the Kane family has its queen, a woman who spent 5 years in the shadows only to step into the light on the one night it would have been safer to run, and their journey from a silence neither would break to a partnership written in fire and ash proves the oldest and most dangerous truth of that world, that loyalty is a weapon sharper than any blade, and love the one alliance that can never be bought, only chosen. If you felt your own pulse quicken when Norah turned the wheel toward the danger instead of away from it, if you wanted to see the woman in the corner of the room finally claim the seat that was always hers, then tap that like button and let it be known. Share this story with anyone who believes the strongest people are the ones who keep an exit ready, and the bravest are the ones who, just once, refuse to use it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of ruthless power, buried secrets, and the kind of love that walks straight into the fire, because the next one begins where this one ends, in the silence between the numbers, where everything that truly matters has always been hiding.